throughout the world are the headquarters from which the war against cancer is waged. A costly and intricate war whose weapons demand huge sums of money.
The medical arsenal that doctors had in the 60s to fight cancer was developing, but survival rates were shockingly low. Less than a quarter of cancer patients survived.
Not only research, but treatment too requires costly apparatus.
The first chemotherapy agent had been licensed in the 40s, ironically a derivative of the mustard gas used in the First World War to kill soldiers in the trenches. But the idea of using drugs to treat cancer had a longer history.
In fact, you can go all the way back to a German chemist in the early 1900s, where he had laboratories testing drugs. And then for the 50 years before 1963, many people were trying to develop models where they could screen drugs for potential activity. What happened was the clinical programs never got built. There are a couple. There was one at Columbia University where Alfred Gellhorn, a surgeon who sort of converted himself into a chemotherapist and was giving chemotherapy, the chairman of medicine closed it down and fired him.
Even when Vincent DeVita started his work, chemotherapy was still widely seen as too toxic to benefit patients. But Dr. DeVita wasn't deterred. Teaming up with another young medic at the Cancer Institute, Jack Moxley, the two decided to try something completely new, to see if you could use not just one drug to kill cancer cells, but 4 in combination, attacking the cancer, as it were, from all sides.
We were young. We were well trained, but we weren't trained in oncology, so we didn't have these precepts burned in our brains. And the idea of using any drugs in combination was considered, bad medicine. First of all, you shouldn't be using combinations of drugs in any field. And then in the cancer field, you're talking about drugs that were toxic enough that people questioned whether you should use 1, let alone 4. You had to have a good reason, and we worked out the good reason.
That reason was some research that was going on rather controversially at the time into leukemia, cancer of the white blood cells, using this idea.
Yes, indeed. So we said if it can be tried in leukemia, it can be tried in solid tumors, but you have to make certain adjustments. We worked out how the marrow grew, how the tumors grew, and how to put it together so they could be given safely in a cyclical fashion, and make the calculations in terms of duration of therapy and intermittent scheduling in an adult, which was important because later we developed a program for breast cancer that became the standard treatment for about 20 years.
But first, they had to overcome the hostility of the medical establishment.
The main treatment was surgery, and the feeling was if you could get it all, that you might cure the patient. Although getting it all was an illusion, because when you took breast cancer out, you appeared to have gotten it all. The great majority of those patients actually relapsed. And so the idea that you could give drugs that have side effects that make patients feel sicker than they already are, and you can't cure them. So what we set out to do was to prove that you could, in fact, cure advanced cancer with drugs. And that was the part that, if you got up and said at a meeting, I've designed a protocol and the goal is to cure the patient, they thought you were kind of funny in the head.
But, of course, when you and Jack Moxley started out, you didn't know if it would work, did you?
We knew if it succeeded, it would be important. The odds were it was going to fail. And the only place we could do it would be a place like the Cancer Institute, which is a fairly protected environment in terms of what you did. You could admit patients and keep them there for as long as you want. They didn't have to worry about insurance or anything like that.
The first program you did was for Hodgkin's lymphoma, which back then few people survived. Tell me about those first patients that you tested this new treatment on.
These were patients who had been told by their doctors that they had a fatal disease. So the patients that came to us, they were told they were going to die, and they were willing to try. Now, there was a kind of rules of the thumb at the time. One was if you're testing a new drug, you would test it in 14 patients. If you didn't see any good responses at 14, then that was the end of it. If you saw 1, you might add a few more patients. So when we did it on the first 14 patients, and 80% of them, the tumor all disappeared, that was beyond what normally happened with a new drug. So we thought we had something.
In fact, what they had was groundbreaking. Within 3 to 4 months of receiving the treatment, most of those first patients went into remission.
And these patients, bless their hearts, put their lives in our hands. And of course, they were exhilarated. Some of them are still alive. One woman writes a letter to us every year. In fact, of the first 188 patients we treated, in most cases they die of other things, heart disease and stuff like that.
Today, instead of 9 out of 10 Hodgkin's lymphoma patients dying, 7 out of 10 survive.
Nobody had ever presented a disease-free survival curve before. So I wanted to wait 4 years, so I had a nice disease-free survival curve to show. And I presented the first batch, I think it was in 1967.
And how was that received?
It caused quite a stir. I was taken to task by one of the greats in the field for using the terminology complete remission, which seems like a trivial point, but it was because nobody had ever seen complete remissions in patients who had solid tumors. And then we published it in 1971, and that turned out to be the most cited paper in the history of the annals of internal medicine.
This was what is now known as the famous MOP protocol, an acronym from the first letters of the 4 drugs that make up the course of treatment, today regarded as one of the great success stories of cancer research. Vincent DeVita and his colleagues later went on to use the same principles to develop treatments for breast cancer. But it took a long time, didn't it, to get it accepted? Not so much by your peers, but by doctors out in the country.
The main problem was they didn't believe that you could cure the patient. So you can see the logic. If I can't cure them, why am I making them sick and lose their hair for the remainder of their life? So the more I could show survival curves free of disease, the more people became convinced, and then they would say to the patient, look, it's going to make you sick, but this is the way to get rid of the tumor.
Because the side effects of chemotherapy were, of course, and still are, very hard.
There were funny stories at the Cancer Institute where I'd walk down the hall of the clinic and a patient would see me and throw up. They were so used to getting the drugs that I gave them that they would reflexly, like a Pavlovian reflex, vomit. Some patients just couldn't take it and it wouldn't take the drug.
And you travelled the country, didn't you, and Europe, talking to doctors, telling them how important it was to stick to the regimen, stick to the dose, the cycle.
Yeah, practicing doctors would omit a drug. They just didn't like the way it affected the patient. So they would modify the program to try to make it so that they wouldn't get any side effects. Some big institutions modified it so the patients could travel back and forth to the institution without getting sick. And then they would say, well, I can't get it to work. And we would say, you've got to give it the way it's designed and always give all 4 drugs together. It still goes on to some extent. There are doctors who just refuse to believe that you really can do something with chemotherapy, but not like it was.
In 1980, Vincent DeVita was appointed director of the National Cancer Institute, where he introduced the first goals for cutting cancer deaths in America. He has himself survived prostate cancer, and in 2015 published a book, The Death of Cancer, explaining why he thinks the war on cancer is winnable. He was talking to me, Louise Hidalgo, for Witness History.
This is the BBC World Service, and here's Harriet Gilbert to tell you about January's World Book Club.
Naomi Alderman joins me to talk about the power. In the newly created Republic of Women, teenage girls have the ability to electrocute people at will. It's a what-if story about power, who holds it, who controls it, and how it's used.
World Book Club with Naomi Alderman from the 4th of January. And in 30 minutes, the Why Factor with Nastaran Tavakulifar.
Why is the father-son relationship so important?
It appears that the father understands certain things intuitively about raising the son.
The son uses the father as the primary template on which to build his personality.
That's in an hour. The newsroom is next on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
At 13 hours GMT, welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Janat Jalil. 5 people have been sentenced to death in Saudi Arabia for the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi last year.
The prosecutor suggested that this was a mission that went wrong, that there had been no intention to kill, but the plan was to bring Mr. Khashoggi back, and that this was a spur-of-the-moment decision.
Algeria's powerful military chief, who played a key role in forcing out the veteran leader Abdelaziz Bouteflika, has died. Warnings the defeated Islamic State group is on the rise once again in Iraq.
It will take a long time. It's hard to stop this killing and destruction.
And a study finds that men who are dependent on alcohol or drugs are 6 times more likely to abuse their partners. That's all coming up on the newsroom after this bulletin of World News.
BBC News. Hello, I'm Jerry Smith. Saudi Arabia has sentenced 5 people to death for the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. 3 others have been jailed for terms totaling more than 20 years. The kingdom faced international condemnation for Mr. Khashoggi's killing in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul last year. But a spokesman for the Saudi state prosecutor said the murder wasn't planned in advance and that it happened in the spur of the moment. With more details, here's Frank Gardner.
There are a number of reasons why critics think that this trial hasn't been open and fair. For a start, it was held for 11 months in great secrecy. Journalists were not allowed to attend it. They still haven't even revealed the names of the 5 men who've been sentenced to death. But I think most importantly, there is a feeling that the people at the top, the chief suspects on this, have got away with it. So, for example, Sarul Gahtani, who was the Crown Prince's right-hand person, he was investigated but cleared. Ahmed al-Assiri, the deputy head of intelligence, who was reported to have ordered or arranged all of this, he was investigated but is not been convicted. And of course the Crown Prince himself, he has not even been investigated. He's above the law, effectively.
State media in Algeria say the head of the army, Ahmed Gayed Salah, who briefly became the country's de facto leader earlier this year, has died of a heart attack. He was 79. 3 days of mourning have been declared. Abla Clark reports.
The sudden death of the man considered by many to be the most powerful in Algeria will no doubt shock a nation already facing political turmoil. General Gayed Salah was once a member of the former president Abdelaziz Bouteflika's inner circle. He turned against his leader and called for his resignation in April after months of anti-government protests. The general assumed leadership and called the elections which took place this month.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin has officially opened the railway bridge connecting Russia's Taman Peninsula with Crimea, the Ukrainian territory annexed by Moscow in 2014. State television showed him riding in the driver's cab as the train rumbled over the bridge. Here's Sarah Rainsford.
Certainly, Russia is trying to paint it as an event of huge significance. If you look at the state TV bulletins, they've been going heavily on this opening. It's the latest opening of a section of the bridge because, of course, the bridge was open to road traffic last year. It's obviously hugely symbolic as far as Moscow is concerned. This is about underlining the physical unification of Crimea to Russia as Moscow sees it, and the fact that Russia sees the annexation of Crimea as something that's very permanent now and irreversible.
Senior Kurdish and Western intelligence officials have told the BBC that the Islamic State group is reorganizing in Iraq 2 years after its military defeat there. A Kurdish counter-terrorism official said IS has as many as 10,000 fighters and sympathizers in the country. News from the BBC. China is to cut import tariffs on more than 850 products from January the 1st. The Ministry of Finance said the goods range from frozen pork and avocado to semiconductors and paper. The move is expected to benefit many of China's trading partners as well as Chinese consumers. China has denied forcing prisoners to work following allegations that inmates at Qingpu prison in Shanghai had to pack charity Christmas cards for the British supermarket chain Tesco. It's now stopped buying cards from the Chinese firm. From Shanghai, Robin Brandt reports.
Government officials here have dismissed the claims outright. Foreign Ministry spokesman Zheng Shuang said it was made up, and he added that the relevant departments had assured him that Shanghai's Qingpu prison does not at all have forced labour by foreign convicts. The note, said to have been written by convicts, was found in a card by a child in the UK whose father contacted a British former private investigator who'd once served time in the jail here.
Spanish prosecutors are attempting to make sure the Catalan separatist leader, Carles Puigdemont, does not get immunity from prosecution as a member of the European Parliament. They've asked Spain's Supreme Court to petition the European Parliament to declare Mr. Puigdemont ineligible for immunity. Last week, the European Union's top court ruled that his former deputy, Oriol Junqueras, should be recognised as an MEP with immunity from prosecution. Mr. Junqueras was elected before he was sentenced in Spain to 13 years in jail for sedition over his part in the campaign. Opposition politicians in Zambia have condemned the arrest of a prominent musician and anti-corruption campaigner. Police say Chama Fumba, who performs under the name Pilato, was arrested on Saturday for addressing an unauthorised rally. BBC News.
Welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Janat Jalil. A Saudi court has sentenced 5 people to death over the killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. His murder last year in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul led to a global outcry against Saudi Arabia and its Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
3 others were given jail terms totaling 24 years, but 2 senior officials implicated in the case were cleared of wrongdoing. Our Middle East analyst, Alan Johnson, is with me in the studio. And Alan, just remind us about this killing and why it caused so much outrage.
Perhaps what made the murder all the more shocking was the amount of appalling detail that emerged. First, there was video of Mr. Khashoggi entering the consulate. You see this smartly dressed man, unaware that he was walking to his death, unaware of the horror that was about to engulf him. Because the consulate had been bugged by the Turkish intelligence services, there were tapes, and we all heard the killers coldly discussing their plan to butcher this man. He was injected with a substance, killed, and then cut up, his dismembered body parts distributed, dumped we know not where. His relatives have never got his remains back. This was a brutal slaying that really captured the world's imagination in the worst way as its details unfolded.
And this trial has largely been held behind closed doors. What do we know about how it's been conducted?
As you say, behind closed doors in secrecy in Riyadh. It began last January. 11 people were on trial. We knew that the prosecution was asking for 5 death penalties, and they have indeed been handed down now. 3 other people were sentenced to jail terms that totaled 24 years. A very senior Saudi intelligence chief was acquitted, and another key figure, a man called Saud al-Qahtani, was investigated but not charged. Now, Mr. Qahtani is a key aide to the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The prosecutor said that the killing hadn't been premeditated. He described it as a spur-of-the-moment decision, which some people will very much doubt, I think.
Indeed. What do you think the international reaction will be to these verdicts and sentences?
Well, there is very little faith indeed abroad in the Saudi justice system. A UN investigator who carried out an examination of the case described today's verdict as a mockery. She said that the hitmen had been punished, but the murder's masterminds had gone free. She had advocated an inquiry into the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, but he has always denied any involvement in the crime.
Alan, thank you very much for that. Our Middle East analyst, Alan Johnston there. Algeria's powerful military chief, General Ahmed Gaid Salah, has died. He played a key role in pushing out the country's longtime president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, earlier this year in response to massive street demonstrations by Algerians. 3 days of national mourning have been declared. For more on the significance of General Salah's death, I spoke to the BBC's Abla Klar, who is herself of Algerian origin.
He joined Algeria's National Liberation Army at the age of 17, and he fought against French colonial forces at the time. He then became head of the army in 2004, and he's quietly kept that role since, so we hadn't heard much of him up until the protests began in February of this year. So they were anti-government protests, basically calling for a reform in the whole political system, and he came out as the de facto leader after calling on the former president Abdelaziz Bouteflika's resignation. He did that in a public speech on television, and swiftly after, the president had resigned and he took power.
And Bouteflika was a very elderly figure, someone who the protesters saw as just being emblematic of the elite and not really listening to their concerns. So the general was able to push him out, but then he also pushed through presidential elections earlier this month, which the protesters objected to.
Yes, he did. He was very clear about what he thought of those calling for the elections to be cancelled, because that's what the demonstrators were asking for. They said that this election was just a ploy. It was just to further kind of push for this military elite to kind of lead on with their power, as you will. So in a public speech, he called them out, and he said that they are a criminal gang, they're full of bitterness and visceral hate for the country. So he was saying that they were anti-patriotic, and he basically ordered security forces to stop any kind of disruptions during the elections. So he was very clear that the elections were to go ahead, despite mass demonstrations. Every week people were out calling for the elections to be cancelled. but he refused to do that.
And what's happening with those demonstrations now, given that these elections have been held despite the protesters' objections?
I mean, many will say that, people haven't been going out as much. They have been continuing every single week. It's been, I think, 44 weeks, 44 Fridays last Friday, and people have been continuing, but they are tired. It's mainly youth-led, so it is a lot of students and a lot of youngsters who cannot get employment in the country because of the economic situation there. They feel that the elite are basically taking all the country's wealth, and there isn't equal distribution. There aren't any opportunities. People are going to university, but they can't get jobs afterwards because of nepotism. So there are deep social issues there that people have been demanding for weeks. And, this I think will be a shock to many people.
Ablakar. As fires continue to rage in Australia, the debate has been intensifying around the nation's coal industry. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, had been criticised for going on holiday to Hawaii while the bushfires crisis engulfed large parts of the country. He's now conceded that there could be a link to climate change, but he's been criticised for refusing to reduce Australia's reliance on coal. The newsroom's Alice Adderley reports.
Despite an easing of the extremely high temperatures, which reached 49 degrees Celsius in South Australia on Friday, firefighters are still struggling to contain bushfires burning across several states. High winds are forecast this week, which could further hamper their efforts. The bushfires have almost completely razed one Australian community, the town of Balmoral, southwest of Sydney, where about 400 people live. One resident there, Steve Harrison, said the fire arrived so quickly he didn't have time to get out. A potter by trade, he constructed a makeshift kiln where he hid.
I lost, I think 6 of my 8 neighbours have lost their houses around me in this little corner. It's just like a blackened moonscape with black sticks. There's nothing green. It's pretty shocking. But, I mean, there's no way you could prepare for anything like this. It's just off the scale.
Residents are currently not allowed to return to the town. More than 800 houses have been destroyed in New South Wales since the fire season began. Australia's Conservative Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has doubled down on his defence of the coal industry, despite conceding that climate
What's happening?